Greetings. I have a video titled Yakoba's Mermaids, Teo's Cryptozoology. And that video recently received a comment from an apparent Teo supporter who was, I guess we could say, less than enthusiastic about the video. And one part of the comment basically argued that it doesn't matter if the Animal Planet mockumentaries about mermaids were fictional because, according to this person, the Bible mentions sirens, which are mermaids. Therefore, mermaids exist, period, end of sentence. Now, I don't know which translations the author of that comment prefers, and therefore I'm not entirely certain which verses that person had in mind, but it is the case that certain translations of the Bible, most notably in the Septuagint, contain apparent references to sirens. And let's take a look at a few examples. For example, you can find such in 4th Maccabees 15:21, which right there on your right. And aside from that, you can find it in Job 30:29, right here on your left. And aside from that, you can also find a reference to sirens in Micah 1:8. And you can find it also multiple times in Isaiah. However, here on your screen, we're looking at Isaiah 34:13. And aside from that, you can also find it in Jeremiah 27:39, at least according to the Septuagint rendering. But of course, chapter 27 in the Septuagint corresponds to chapter 50 in the Masoretic text. And with the exception of 4th Maccabees, all those verses have ancient counterparts in Hebrew, Syriac, Latin, and Ge'ez. And when you look up the relevant verses in the Masoretic text, the Peshitta, or the Vulgate, you see that the conversation becomes a bit more complex, as in a sizable percentage of instances, those other ancient versions seem to be clearly referring to birds. In fact, I would say when it comes to the Vulgate and the Peshitta and the Masoretic text, perhaps the majority of those references are to birds, whether they be owls or, in the case of the Vulgate, ostriches. And even in the case where they might be referring to something reptilian, like when the Hebrew text employs danin, or the Vulgate employs draco, or some variation thereof, there's a question of word order, as even in those instances, there'll be a reference to a bird right next to it, right? And the Ge'ez translation is a bit different, but even there, in, for example, Job 30:29, it has tziganat, which can mean owl. And regarding 4th Maccabees, the Syriac translation has sirinus, which is the plural of sirin, which is clearly related to siren. And yet even that Syriac term has within its semantic range references to birds as well. And something similar happens with the Ge'ez translation of Isaiah 43:20 and Micah 1:8, which likewise both employ a Ge'ez term clearly related to the word siren, yet which likewise has within its semantic range a possible reference to an ostrich. Now, of course, there could be a much longer conversation on those texts, right? We could do a whole video on that subject. But the point I'm trying to convey is that even if a text employs a reference to a siren, what precisely it's referring to can still be open to question and discussion. And with that in mind, I wanted to show a clear example of this in Rashi's 11th century commentary on the Talmud. So on your screen is a page from Talmud Bavli, or the Babylonian Talmud, specifically tractate Bekhorot 8a. Now, the column of text in the center of the page is the actual Talmudic text, while all the surrounding columns are commentary and notes. And this column here on the right is the 11th century commentary of Rashi. Now, a typical way to approach this would be to first show the relevant Talmudic text and then show Rashi's commentary on that text. But as a bit of a fun exercise, which I think will help to illustrate the point I'm trying to make, we're going to look at these texts in reverse, starting with an explicit reference to sirens in Rashi's commentary, and then moving from there backwards to the text that he was commenting on. So jumping right in, I'd like to start here, where Rashi attempts to clarify what's under discussion by describing it as follows. He says, Bela'az sirena, Now, as I covered in a video from 3 years ago titled Medieval French in a Medieval Hebrew Torah Commentary, Rashi would occasionally try to clarify a topic for his immediate audience, which was in France. Rashi was in France, and his audience was in France, and he would attempt to clarify a topic by transliterating a word or phrase from his own 1,000-year-old dialect of French into Hebrew characters. And this is an instance of that phenomenon. When he says Bela'az, La'az refers to his dialect of French. And in this text, Rashi was trying to describe a certain kind of creature, and he used the word sirena to describe it. And the word he was using clearly corresponds to the modern French word sirène, which corresponds to the English word siren. So Rashi was saying that the creature being referred to in the text is known as a siren, or as he called it, sirena. So now let's look at a bit more of what Rashi wrote on this subject. You see, immediately before the two words we just looked at, Rashi wrote the following. Notice that the first two words of this underlined text are in bold. That's because the portion in bold is a quote from the Talmudic text he was commenting on. That bold text reads, Bnei Yama, sons of the sea. And then Rashi comments on that as follows. Dagim yesh bayam, shechatziyin tzorat adam, vechatziyin tzorat dag. Fish which exist in the sea that are partially the form of a man and partially the form of a fish. And it was immediately after that that he said they're called sirena, or sirens. And at this point, it feels like Rashi is pretty clearly referring to mermaids. And with that in mind, let's now take a look at the Talmudic text he was commenting on. So here's the phrase he was commenting on, Bnei Yama, sons of the sea. And now, let's look at the text which immediately precedes that. It reads as follows, quote, Hadolfinin parin verabin kebnei adam. And before I translate that, look at that first word, hadolfinin. The first letter, which I marked in gray, is merely the definite article, right? And the last two letters, which I marked in light blue, are the part of the plural suffix. They form the plural suffix. So this is, to signify that this noun is in the plural. But the base noun is dolphin. And I think you can guess what that might be referring to. So the text reads, hadolfinin parin verabin kebnei adam. The dolphins bear fruit and multiply like man. And the context of this statement was a discussion on oviparous and viviparous animals, which is to say animals that lay eggs and animals that give birth directly to their young, as mammals do. So these quote-unquote dolphinin were described as those that bear fruit and multiply like men do, which is to say they were viviparous. They gave birth directly. And, they're not exactly like fish. They're a bit more like mammals, it would seem. And the text goes on to raise this question. My dolphinin, what are dolphins? And then it answers, Amar Rab Yehuda b'nei Yama. Rabbi Yehuda said, sons of the sea. And then, as you saw, Rashi commented on that and said that they partially resembled men and partially resembled fish, and they were called sirens or sirena. Now, I'm not claiming that Rashi understood what dolphins were. On the contrary, he seems to say in another related text that on the same page that humans can get these creatures pregnant. So, he may well have had in mind full-on mythological mermaids, right? When he tried to explain this text, right? He might not have fully understood what the Talmudic text was actually referring to. But the fact remains that the text can easily be understood as referring to dolphins, even if Rashi didn't understand that because he was unfamiliar with dolphins, and perhaps he was influenced by the local mythology of his time. And I wanted to share this as an analogy, perhaps as a cautionary tale. You see, an ancient or medieval writer might write a translation or a commentary and might understand the text as referring to something which most modern minds would consider mythological. And yet the text itself that the translator or commentator was working with, that text might have actually been referring to some uncontroversial animal whose existence is not in dispute. And before I close this video, I'd like to offer one more analogy in that regard, and it's found in Pliny's Naturalis Historia, as in specifically Book 8, Chapter 31 of Pliny's Natural History. One can find a reference to an interesting animal, which he says is found in India. See, he refers to the monoceros, and actually it's here in the accusative, it's monocerotem, that word, monoceros, refers to the unicorn. And there's actually a few places in the King James Bible where the unicorn is mentioned, and the corresponding Septuagint translations of those verses have monokeros. And monokeros, the Greek word monokeros, corresponds to the Latin term you see here, monoceros, which again is monocerotem in the accusative, which is what's on the page. Now, Pliny describes this animal, and he says something fascinating, which I think gives away what it was actually referring to. He describes this so-called unicorn as having pedibus elephanto, or the feet of an elephant. And at this point, being that he was referring to an animal in India, I think it's pretty clear that he's referring to the Indian rhino. And today, that species is actually called, in its Latin taxonomic binomial, Rhinoceros unicornis, right? The unicorn rhinoceros. And it's called that because it has only one horn. And I share that to say that while fantastic stories about horned horses called unicorns may have taken on mythological qualities over time, some of the references to unicorns might actually go back to something as uncontroversial as an Indian rhinoceros. And that serves as an analogy for this video's discussion on sirens. There are different texts which refer to sirens, but some of them might have been referring to birds. And at least one example, that being the reference in Rashi's medieval commentary on the Talmud, might have actually been a reference to dolphins. Food for thought. And with that, I'll close this video here. As always, I look forward to any comments, questions, or criticisms. So feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. And God bless.